Hi, everyone. Welcome to Otto's Expeditions, our live build session where we're going to be building data pipelines in Gen3 of Ascend. On the agenda today, we have some introductions. We're going to be doing a live demo building the product, and then we'll have time for some questions and answers at the end. So first, we want to introduce ourselves as your hosts. My name is Shifra. My pronouns are she, they, and I am the DevRel advocate at Ascend.
And my name is Cody. My pronouns are he, him, and I am a product manager at Ascend. I'll see you in a few minutes. Have fun, Shifra.
Thanks, Cody. And we also wanted to introduce our little friend in the top right. His name is Otto, and he is our data pipeline goat. He's going to come up a little bit later, so stay tuned for that. Now, we wanted to start off with what Ascend does best. So as you all know, Ascend is your all-in-one data platform with every stage of your pipeline in one place. From ingest to transform, deliver to orchestrate, and even optimize, Ascend brings it all together. But with the data landscape evolving fast, we had to ask, what does the next era of data engineering really look like? As data engineering evolves to handle more complex use cases, the need for automation and AI is only growing. And so that's where the intelligence core and its unified metadata foundation really comes into play. So this core is collecting signals across ingest, transform, orchestrate, and delivery. And what makes this so powerful is that all of that metadata fuels our integrated AI agent, which makes it deeply context aware. On top of that, the data-aware automation engine, a flexible event-driven architecture, lets you automate with precision. And together, this intelligence layer turns metadata into real-time action. To make all of this possible, we didn't just add features, we actually redesigned the entire platform. We took a step back and reimagined the platform from the ground up so teams can tap into Ascend's AI and automation like never before. The result is a platform built to supercharge productivity across platform, data, and analytics engineering. And with data ops baked in, teams get built-in best practices for governance, reliability, and scale right out of the box. Of course, with a major shift like this, we wanted to show how familiar Gen 2 concepts actually map to the new Gen 3 experience. So let's take a look. Looking at mapping Gen 2 to Gen 3, we can see that you have the same read-write connectors that you're used to connect all of your data sources. You have the familiar SQL and Python transforms that allow you to customize your workflows as much as you want. And you have the DAG view that you're used to find everything you need. The main change here is that the data service concept from Gen 2 is split into workspaces and deployments in Gen 3. And don't worry, we're going to talk more about all of that later. The main takeaway here is that it's familiar workflows with all new capabilities. Now that you've seen how the key concepts evolve from Gen 2 to Gen 3, let's look at how it all comes together in practice. So here's a look at the core architecture that is powering Ascend Gen 3. At the top, everything starts with projects. Those are then split into development workspaces where teams build and collaborate. And then you also have deployments, which allow you to monitor things at every stage of your lifecycle. And under the hood, the foundation is made up of Git repos for version control, a data plane like Snowflake, Databricks, or BigQuery for executing workloads, an instance store for state management, and a vault for secure secrets handling. This layered design gives teams the flexibility to move fast while staying secure and scalable. Now that you've seen the architecture, let's dig into the exciting new features that make Gen 3 so powerful. Everything we're talking about today is actually the result of direct feedback from you, our customers. We built this new platform to streamline your workflows and make pipeline development faster, smoother, and more intuitive. So let's get into it. We have a new developer UI with an improved builder experience. We have a simple file system where everything is backed by Git natively. So you're going to get complete version history, full traceability, and no guesswork as to what's going on with your pipelines. You're going to have multi-environment deploys with built-in support for the software development lifecycle, and best practices make promoting code across environments seamless. You're going to have a full run history, which means there's no more black box here, right? You get full visibility into every execution, every step, and every decision. You're also going to see parameterization, which makes your workflows more reusable and modular so you can scale without duplicating effort. That leads into extensible automation and improved pipeline optimization, and of course, AI in the form of our friend Otto, plus much more. Now, we're seeing some major efficiency improvements in Gen 3. Up to 70% less code to build the same pipelines, faster deployment times, and a much smoother dev experience overall. Of course, everyone's mileage can vary a little bit, and these numbers are based on what we've seen in our own workflows and with early adopters. That said, depending on how you build, you might see even greater gains. For example, if you lean heavily on templates and reusable components, you could potentially see code reduction that goes beyond the 70% stat here. We also have a 2 times increase in developer efficiency. And the main takeaway here is that Gen 3 is designed to help you move faster with less overhead so you can focus on solving data problems, not fighting your tooling. And the performance gains don't stop there. With Gen 3, we've seen up to 70% reduction in infrastructure costs thanks to smarter resource usage and more efficient execution. Ingestion speeds are up to 4 times faster, and overall runtime execution is twice as fast, getting data where it needs to be quicker than ever. And for teams running high volume workflows, Gen 3 supports up to a 10% increase in concurrent processing, so you can scale without bottlenecks. With all that said, it's time to build. I'll hand it off to Cody, and I'll see you at the end.
Thank you so much, Shifra. So with that great overview of Gen 3 of Ascend's product, let's dive into it. So I have loaded up our Autos Expedition instance of Ascend in Gen 3. This is our premier or marquee project that you can see is hosted in an internal repository here. So as Shifra mentioned, all code for Ascend projects in Gen 3 are backed by a Git repository, and this offers unprecedented observability into when things are changing, how they're changing, and how that affects your production deployments. We'll see that as we go through the demo here. Autos Expeditions is available for you to go try out yourself, and it implements all of these best practices that allow your data engineers to work like software engineers following software development lifecycle best practices. Okay, this is our Autos Expeditions project. As I mentioned, it's in a repo, and then we specify a path to the directory that project lies in. And then we have some deployments, a development deployment, a staging deployment, and a production deployment, and a bunch of workspaces. So as Shifra mentioned before, and I'll flash back to this slide here that we went through, we have projects as the top level concept that holds a bunch of your flows, your automations, your data connections, all these things that we'll get into. And then for a project, you deploy that into a deployment, and that is what is running in production and goes through a dev to stage to prod workflow. And then you have workspaces, and workspaces are where individual developers like myself, Cody, or Shifra, or any other Ascend employees in here, can go and do their work. So you'll do your work in a workspace, you'll work off of a feature branch, and when you are done or you want to merge that, you will simply go in to merge that branch into the main branch, which is deployed on your development deployment, and from there merge it into staging and production. So again, all this is set up so that you're following best practices out of the gate. And with that, let's dive into all the new features that we see in these deployments and in our workspaces. Let's start by jumping into the development deployment here for Autos Expeditions. We'll actually see that we have stuff kicked off that started on the hour and is running, so that's always cool to see. But this is our overview page of how this deployment is operating in practice. So we see things like div runs. Again, we have 2 running right now. Recent errors, and we can go back and see when those errors started and what's going on there. Recent runs, our last deploy, so we can see that everything's successful, status is all good. And this is where the Git history comes in. So we can also see the latest change. We can dive into the Git history and understand who was changing which flows and components and how that might have affected things. And of course, from Gen 1 and Gen 2, we haven't lost any of that intelligent core with the ability to not reprocess partitions that have already been processed in the system. So you can see with our example here, a very small fraction of our partitions are actually being reprocessed. I am going to head very quickly here into a different instance that just has a little bit more data that has been running for a while. If we click in here, we see this has only been running for a few days. So let me just flip over to my Kodi app dev instance. Again, this is running effectively the same thing. The only reason why I wanted to switch over here is that the data goes back a bit farther. So if you click into the view for your flow history, you will get this nice thing that is showing you all of your flows over time. While I only have 5 in this particular project, a typical project for a real production use case might have dozens or even hundreds of flows or many more. So this graph becomes very useful for being able to quickly scan across them when things are failing. And these rocket ships here are corresponding to when deployments happen. So this is indicating to me that I deployed a bunch, then I got a failure. I could probably go dig in and find out that failure corresponds to my deployment there. And again, this goes all the way back. You can see when I had a bunch more errors and a bunch of deployments to go fix those. And it's really cool to get this level of observability in Ascend. Heading back here, I can also go into an individual flow and see the status and history of components within that flow. So we can start by doing that in the extract load flow here. And I see a line basically for each component that is in this flow. And similarly, I can scroll back in time to the left, again, see when things were being deployed and see when these failures are happening to help me track things down. You also get a bunch of cool lineage that you can see of individual components. So in this case, on the left-hand side here, you can see we had this route component that accidentally got renamed into a router component. So you can see that in the history here, you see the component getting deleted, this one getting added. You see me realizing that I did that on accident and fixing that in a couple deploys later. So cool. That's an overview of our extract load flow. And I do want to note that you can also see the graph for the flow up here. We can make that full screen so it's a little bit easier to explore, but we'll get into these graphs a lot more in a minute. Also, while I'm here, I'll just point out that you can also run a flow or a backfill on your deployment from this page as well. Let's dive into the metrics flow real quick. You'll see a very similar thing, fewer components in here, but same general overview. Again, you can see here that I actually intentionally renamed a component this time, and you can see that in the history. This one as well, we're going to fly through a lot of content, and quite frankly, we're probably going to go over the 30 minutes, but this will all be recorded. So I'm going to try to mention some things, and you can always go into our docs, which are helpfully linked from at the top here to learn more about a bunch of this stuff. But I did want to point out that we do have a compound component in this flow. And this is basically a way of allowing you to define templates or even Python code to generate common code and allow you to really dry things up. Don't repeat yourself. And in this case, all we're doing is passing a different value into these three subcomponents. And that is going and generating these components off of a single value instead of having to go and write the same SQL across all three of these. So, okay, that's our metrics flow. And the other flow we have in here, perhaps the most interesting one, is actually this transformation flow. We'll head into the DAG for that in the workspace. You can see that it's actually running right now. So we get all of this nice observability into what's going on. Looks like it's waiting on one and then two components to finish. And then I have the history. So again, I can go through and spot errors, click through into those and see what was going on when bad things happened. Let's follow that process quickly. So I'll just click on this component and I'm taken to the view in the DAG where I can see that this failed 6 days ago. I can see the timeline of when all these components were running and when that one failed and all the things that didn't finish after. And I can actually click into the error here to go and read that. In this case, I believe this specific error was me in the BigQuery going and deleting things while stuff was running. So not too worried about that. But that's how you can get that view. And then you'll end up here. So this is going to look a lot like the workspace that we're going to run through in a minute. But this light blue background is indicating that we are in a read-only mode. So if I come in here and try to open up a file, I can't actually go and make edits in here, but I can go and view everything. You'll notice that I just switched to a file tab up here on the left, and that's how I get all those files that are corresponding to all of my Ascend resources, flows, connections, all that good stuff. And then we also have a build tab here, and this lets you, for one, more easily navigate and also has some additional functionality we'll see in a workspace. And then again, as I've mentioned, you have full observability into all the code changes that have happened, so that have gone into this deployment or other branches that you're working off of. So I can always open the Git log, see who's been making changes, dig into anything specifically and see what files have changed, and also have some options for merging things. We'll explore all that in a bit. Let's double check if there's anything else we wanted to see in a deployment. It is worth mentioning, I'm not going to get super in depth in this webinar, but all of this automation is happening through our automations here. So the extract load flow that we took a look at is configured in this automation to run every hour on the hour. And then the transform automation is set to run on a successful flow run of the extract load. Basically what we saw earlier was at the top of the hour, the extract load flow here that I shouldn't have clicked into started. Once that completed successfully, the transform flow went off and ran, and that has been running most of the time I've been talking here. And then about a minute or two ago, that completed successfully, and now we're seeing the metrics flow run. So these automations are enabled in deployments and allow you to basically run things on a schedule or triggered in an event-driven fashion. So cool. I think that's everything I wanted to cover in the deployments. Like I said, ton of content, a lot of things in our documentation up here that you can go read. And really excited to start getting this in public preview into the hands of our public preview customers. With that, as we talked about back here, we've been looking at a deployment of a project, and this is how you put things through the typical dev stage prod workflow. But to go edit a project, to go do my work as a data engineer, I'll head into a workspace. We have this handy option here to go open your workspace from a deployment and basically create a new branch and use either the deployments profile or more typically you'll use your own development profile. I'm not going to go through this. As you'll recall, we switched instances earlier on just to get a little more full history in this deployment view. So let's actually switch back to our Autos Expeditions instance. Again, we're in the deployment view here. And then I'm going to go back up to my project and switch to my workspace. So again, we're back in this view. We see our deployments. We've explored those. Let's go into a workspace, build a flow, and actually run through getting that deployed in Ascend. I'm going to head into the Cody workspace, which you can see I already have set up on a webinar branch for my own development here. I'll click into that and I'll see a very similar graph view as what you saw before. In this particular project of Autos Expeditions, I've actually combined BigQuery and Databricks. So that's why you're seeing these side by side with a few more flows. But otherwise, this is effectively the same thing that we were looking at. So let's go through and explore in our workspace, build a new flow, and then get that deployed into our development deployment. Going through what we have in a workspace here, we see similar to before, we have the build tab in the upper left where we can see all these things and also go through and create stuff. I'll go ahead and do this now since we'll need to do this in a second anyway, and we'll create the goat BigQuery flow. There's a bunch of different options you can input here, including like parameters. Parameters are super powerful and let you basically work across different things by setting parameters in different places. That was very vague, but for now, just understand that they're very powerful and they are being used under the hood, but we don't need to worry about them and we can just save here. Another super powerful thing about Ascend to point out is that I just had a GUI for creating what is actually code. Not a lot of code in this case. This is just a almost empty YAML file, but you'll see this kind of experience all over in Ascend, and we call this flex code. And what it does is it allows you to work in a GUI, which is often more natural, especially when you're setting up or you have a bunch of options like what connection name to use, but that always gets saved and backed by code that is in your Git repository. So that enables you to have the Git log here, for instance, where I can see the full history of this file. You can see that I just created it. And you can also see this super handy Git commit message. You might notice that I didn't actually write that commit message. It was actually auto-generated for me by Otto, our helpful AI assistant that Shifra mentioned earlier. You can access Otto from the chat window here on the right. But Otto is always working behind the scenes to make things more delightful, like writing your Git commit messages for you when you're saving files. So that makes it very easy to just go back and see what I was doing. What else? We can see the history of the runs and also the compiled code here. Let me close this out and we can see that the graph is updated and I now have this goat BigQuery flow that's showing up in my build view and also in my file view. The last thing to cover here next to the files are source control. This is very similar to what we were just looking at, but I can see all of my files that have changed compared to my main branch. So you can see I added this comment earlier in the Ascend project YAML, and then this is the file that we just created. And just like before, we can open up the full Git log. We'll get some highlights on things that have changed since the main branch, and also, again, these nice AI-generated commit messages for me. Once we've gone through and built this flow, the process for merging my changes from my workspace branch to my deployment can also be found in the Git log here. So you see that I have the option to squash and sync. So take all of these small commits and squash them into a single commit. I can keep this branch up to date by merging main or any of my deployment branches into this branch. I can conversely merge this branch into main, which in my case is the same as merging to the development deployment, or I can explicitly merge into one of my deployment branches. So this is the process you will follow for GitOps effectively to go through a dev to stage to prod deployment ascend. I'll also note that often you will do this in a tool outside of Ascend, like GitHub or GitLab or something through a pull request process, where you have branch protections preventing you from merging to main. We'll see me do that later, and I've actually gotten and turned off branch protections for our purposes here. But you can use your existing CI/CD pull request processes, or you can do this all through Ascend if you prefer. And again, Ascend is making it super easy to use tools like Git for data engineers with these delightful AI features. And we're really thinking through how to keep this nice and simple for our data engineers. What else? I also wanted to show automations here. So as I said before, these are what are actually powering automatically running things, our deployments. And just like with the flows view, we can see the code here, which is just some YAML, but that might be a little intimidating to go and edit for the first time. So we also have the flex code concept here, where we have a GUI that where you can go in and configure these things and see helpful information like when is my cron job actually going to run versus just looking at a YAML file here. So this is super, super helpful. Makes it super easy to build a lot of the component types and automations within Ascend. And while everything is following these software engineering best practices backed in Git, we still like to keep it very friendly for data engineers who are popping into the platform. So we can see our automations there. Another huge feature is the ability to go in and actually explore your data. So for instance, this is my local files connection. So this is just connecting to the data directory, which I can see in my file system here. You, of course, wouldn't want to keep very large data or most data, frankly, in your Git repository, but this can be useful if you just want to upload a spreadsheet or some sort of CSV that is used as a seed file. And we'll just be using it for our demo purposes here. So from a connection, you can explore it and see the list of files in a connection. Let me also just open our GCS connection side by side. And we can also put those quite literally side by side in our IDE view here. So I'll get that open. And then we are going to build off of this small goat CSV. This only has 3 rows in it. I have not gone through and created a larger data set yet, but this is where you can go through and preview your data and then go and create a component based off of that. I just wanted to show on the right here that more typically you'll have data in cloud storage. Typically it'll be quite nested in there and under some sort of Hive style partitioning that we have here. So all this stuff is good and well unsupported, but let's drop out of here and focus on building our Goat BigQuery data flow. So you're typically going to start from a connection where you're going to read data from. In this case, it's a local file system. And then you're going to create a read component. I can do that right here. I'll go and select the Goats BigQuery flow that I created earlier, and we'll call this read goats and hit create. That'll take a second, but it will pop open the file here for read goats. And I'm actually going to close this for a second and go back into the graph view. So we've also seen this Goats BigQuery flow update such that it has one component. I'm going to double click in here to go into the flow. You can also click on the context menu here and click open flow. And also, while I'm pointing that out, there are a bunch of different ways to do the same things for convenience. So instead of going through the connection, I could have also right clicked anywhere here on the graph view and gone to create a connection. And then I could have basically created a connection for any of these types of things that we support and go from there into building a read component. Anyway, let's click into the goats flow. We'll see the one component that we created. And if I open that back up in the code editor here, I can go ahead and run. I also didn't explain earlier, you're seeing 2 views of code in this kind of IDE view. So this is what we call the modal view. This is where the code is just floating over the background of the DAG. And if you click this button up here to expand it, this is what we call the docked view. So this is allowing you a bunch of files side by side, normal kind of painting where you can move things around. And this is super useful for looking at your upstream components as you are developing new components. And we'll see that flow in a second. So I had clicked on the run button up here to go ahead and run this component. We'll see the events start streaming in. And if I minimize my code view up here, we'll basically see the same thing on the graph view. So this component is starting to run, doesn't know how many records it has, doesn't have any tests, and currently is sitting at 0 out of 1 partitions. This will take a minute, and there we go. Now it's run. Now it knows that it has 3 records. And I believe it's at 0 partitions because I have already gone through this process and processed this particular data set before. So, okay, let's open that back up. And now I can actually go ahead and explore that data. So I can go off and open that in the BigQuery data plane. That's all well and good, though you can also do that right here in Ascend. If I open my BigQuery data plane connection, and we'll move that to the side here, I can see all of my data sets that are getting created here for all of these flows. This is not necessarily following best practices in that we have everything going into one GCP project for our demo purposes here. Normally you would separate these out so you're not seeing develop production in the same place. But anyway, this is a good way to go through and be able to view what kind of tables are in here that are being generated from these components. Let's go ahead and close that out and follow through with creating our downstream transforms. So I can see my records. I can see any test results. We don't have tests on this component that I just created. Super critical is that you can go through and test all of your components as you're doing things. And also partition information. It might be worth us going and taking a look at this on, again, a more interesting component that has partitions. But this has been a huge request from Gen 1 and Gen 2 customers to have more observability into how we're partitioning things and even being able to move these columns around and sort them differently, which won't matter on a single row, but will when you have multiple partitions. So we'll go view that. Let's press on though and create a downstream transform. I'm going to do this twice pretty quickly. So we're going to create a goat py component. That'll open up a new code file. And again, I find it really useful to be able to put this side by side while I'm basically looking through what my previous component had in it. So let me add in the context, save this one, and get it running. And we'll see on the graph view here that the Python component will start up in a second after the build updates, and we'll see that start to run through. Okay, and we see the event starting to stream in here. I'm going to run through and just do this quickly on a SQL component as well, just to get us going. So we'll also create a goat SQL downstream from the read goats component. And we'll just leave that one alone and ensure that everything is running smoothly by looking at our graph again. We can see the Python component that we started earlier running. And this time, let me go and create a downstream task from my SQL component here. So again, we have this context menu you can click into for a component. And then similar to before, we can create a downstream component from here. We'll go investigate why that failed in a second. Let's create our goats task. We'll create it as a Python task. And the only edit here I'm going to make just to demonstrate it is we're actually going to add in the, whoops, wrong place. Let's go ahead and close this so I don't confuse myself. And then let's add in the goats py as an additional upstream component here. So we need to add it to the dependencies because this is Python, add it into the function arguments, and let's just go ahead and print. Cool. All right. So with that, we should basically have the full flow developed that we want to run here. After this finishes building, I can go ahead and run this flow end to end, and we're probably going to get an error, which says something like this. Okay, flow runner not found. This is indicating that I had kicked something off. Long story short, this is a small bug that I think we have fixed. So let me just wait for this to finish building and kick off the flow end to end so that we can see everything working here. Let me just give a refresh just to make sure we're plodding along correctly. All right, so looking good. Our read component is running. That'll take a little bit of time. Then we'll run through these two very simple transform components, and then we'll run through this final task. This is all running on BigQuery. We also support, whoops, not shown here, Databricks and Snowflake. We do find that Databricks and Snowflake warehouses are a bit quicker to get responses from, though once BigQuery gets going, some of these only take a few seconds. For a SQL transform, Python may take a little bit longer, and then the task should execute pretty quickly as well. While we're waiting for that, it's always good to check your changes and make sure that your get state is in line with what you'd expect. So I can see the changes I made before we started doing this and all of the new components in my Goats BigQuery flow down here. And I can go and click into those again and see the full git diff. Most of these are just new files. Let's go ahead and let's just close all this. So we're just looking at the graphs. But again, always really good to go through your commit history and review things before you go and merge them. Before we do go and merge, I had not actually run through the rest of what we see in this graph, and it will be useful to see all of the things that you can build up to in Ascend. So let's maybe head into the transform BigQuery flow and see something that's a little more representative of what real workflows and data pipelines are going to look like. So in this transform flow, we are reading from our upstream components that are in the extract load flow. So that's all of these blue components on the left here. And then we are transforming them. And we can do that with SQL, as we just saw in the goats flow. So this is a super simple SQL transform. Or we can do that with Python. Let me zoom back up in here. Super simple Python example. Again, dissimilar from what we created a few minutes ago. The other huge thing to note is that you now have tasks in Gen3 of Ascend. So we found that very frequently people want to use Ascend for more than just their ELT or ETL, and to either trigger external things or just have more complex side effects that you want to take effect. And the way that you can accomplish that in Gen3 is with a task. So this is a Python task that is using our event logger to log a bunch of stuff to our events. You could also use this to trigger a webhook into some external system, calls whatever REST API you want. All that good stuff would be supported both in a Python task or also in a SQL task like here. What else? Also important to note that you can add tests throughout Ascend. So you can either have standalone test components like this test ascender SQL, which isn't doing anything too interesting, but allows you to basically test for records that are matching what you would expect and return those as a failure in your test. And you can also write tests as Python code here. Additionally, within a component, you can add tests as well. So in the Twitter component here, we can see that we have one test passing, and that gets defined right here, which is telling us that the timestamp column should never be null. And if that ever fails, that would fail this component. And going back to all the observability that we have in our deployments and through our automations, we would know and be able to track that failure came from this component down to that test, and even back into the Git log, who last updated the code if it was a code change that caused that failure instead of a legitimate upstream data issue. Okay, that has been a whirlwind tour of our workspace here. Let's complete the final step of merging those changes we had into our deployment, and that will complete the end-to-end process of building a new flow in Ascend and getting it deployed into a deployment. So all I need to do is head into my Git log here. As I mentioned before, the development deployment that I have is just running off the main branch that allows me to continually integrate and continually test all of the changes that we're making. So I could either merge to main here, or for these purposes, I will merge into the develop branch. Sorry, into develop. So let's do it. I've clicked merge. Merge is successful. And now as we head into that development deployment, we will go see the updates taking effect. So you can see that the build is loading, has detected that things have changed. We can see in the latest change here that this is just now, or a few minutes ago. I changed it. Feel free to email me, and we can see the git commit messages. And again, the full log in the history there. We also see this new Goats BigQuery flow show up. There are no flow runs, but just as before, I can come in here and kick that off. And if I wanted to, go and edit my automations such that this would actually run as part of my regular process in my deployment here. I think that's everything. So this has been again a whirlwind tour of Ascend's Gen 3 product, looking at a project that we have deployed in a deployment, or rather a series of deployments to go through the GitOps lifecycle or software development lifecycle and following GitOps best practices there. We've seen how we can edit code in those projects in a workspace and then take those edits and merge them back into my deployment and then kick off the run and see everything working nice and happily. And with that, I think I will kick it back to Shifra to check if there's anything I missed or any questions from the audience at this point.
Cody, thank you so much for that excellent and very detailed demo of just everything that the Ascend platform has to offer. Let's keep this really short since we are over time. I just have a couple of questions for you. So, Ascend is all about making data engineering delightful. What do you think is the most delightful feature that you demoed today?
Yeah, a ton of good stuff. I am definitely partial to our Git support everywhere and just having that observability in all these SHAs. But quite frankly, going back to our this flow here, to me quite a bit. So just being able to see, oh, I made a typo in my flow, or I probably should be catching these in my testing before, but I've been pretty liberally pushing to production. But even if you're doing that, you can see exactly what is happening and what is changing over time. So just getting this timeline view, this level of granularity, and being able to click through into all these and go see what's going on everywhere is really awesome. And I believe something that should be impressive in Gen 3 for anyone coming from old versions of the platform.
Yeah, 100%. Just seeing the zoomed out and zoomed in view of all the details of all the runs of every component, every flow, it's really powerful. And then one more question for you. I noticed that you were merging directly into a production deployment, which is something that teams might not want to do in the real world. Obviously, this is a demo, but things are different in the real world. So, what's the best way that a team can safeguard against that and enforce a safer deployment practice for their flow?
Yeah. So most teams we find already have some sort of GitOps setup, some sort of Git provider like GitHub or GitLab or Bitbucket or Azure repos are still somewhat common. So you can completely use those tools alongside Ascend to follow a more normal PR process. The key in Ascend is that each of these deployments in each of your workspaces are really mapping to a branch. So as long as you're having some workflow with whatever tests you want, that are getting your changes into that branch, then that is how you can make those changes. And as far as preventing that in Ascend, we're working toward providing more fine grained user and access controls. So you could control within Ascend who can even merge things. But on your Git provider side, you will typically want to protect those branches to avoid what I did earlier in merging directly. So if as a user in Ascend, I did have permission to merge for some reason, but that branch were protected, I would get a failure and it wouldn't
Right.
allow me to do that.
Absolutely. And that just leads into all the features we talked about with CI/CD and Git integrations and just letting Ascend run on top of all the protections you've already set up for your best workflows.
Yep.
Yeah. I think that was all the questions we had for today. And with that, we wanted to thank everyone for joining, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.